Claire moved through the dim hangar with a measured efficiency born of habit. The air was sharp with cold, carrying the metallic tang that always seemed strongest before sunrise. Frost clung to the edge of the open hangar doors, the faint glow of safety vests, catching the yellow cast of the overhead lights. She ran her gloved hands over the panel edges and control surfaces, her eyes scanning each indicator in the cockpit, her breathing steady inside the quiet shell of the aircraft. Outside, the airfield was still, the runway lights stretching into the dark like a fixed constellation. The first wail of the quick reaction alert klaxon tore through the stillness. It began as a low moan and swelled into a deep, unbroken call that seemed to reverberate through the hangar walls. Ground crew members who had been working in slow, practiced movements snapped to faster rhythms. A mechanic hurried past with a final thumbs up before stepping back from the nose of the jet. Claire's voice was calm over the comms as she confirmed systems readiness. Hydraulic pressure built beneath her seat, and the canopy lowered with a steady whine before sealing with a muted click. Her engine spooled with a growing roar that vibrated up through her boots and into her legs. The jet rolled from shadow into the pale edge of dawn, its canopy catching the faintest blush of light on its curve. Frost on the tarmac glittered under the angled floodlights, each crystal a cold spark. The ground crew cleared, the marshaller's flashlight beams cutting a narrow path ahead. She eased the throttle forward, feeling the steady acceleration pull at her shoulders as the runway began to blur beneath her. As the F-16 surged into the sky, the sound softened into the constant rush of air and the muffled hum of machinery. She pierced the first thin veil of cloud, leaving the airfield behind in a clean vertical climb. The upper atmosphere opened around her in an expanse of icy blue, the horizon stretching into a faint curve. Her heads-up display lit with shifting symbols as radar pulses reached outward. Fuel flow readings held steady, altitude markers rising in smooth increments, but far ahead, almost invisible, the faint lines of condensation crossed in the distance, two thin white strokes meeting against the blue. The voice of ground control broke in, clipped and efficient. An Airbus A330 en route from Stockholm to Vilnius had gone silent shortly after reporting technical issues. There had been no further transmissions. Standard intercept procedures were in effect, Claire acknowledged, adjusting her heading to the vector provided. The delay in her wingman's launch meant she would be alone until further notice. It was not unusual, but the solitude carried its own weight. She listened to the calm in the controller's voice, knowing that calm was often the surface above deeper concerns. The cold at altitude was absolute, yet the cockpit felt sealed in its own microclimate. Her hands moved lightly over the controls, trimming for the climb and bringing the engine to optimal cruise thrust. She watched the radar range close in measured steps, each sweep bringing the unseen target nearer. The quiet between comms calls was almost complete, except for the low background hiss of the oxygen flow and the occasional faint creak of the airframe adjusting to pressure changes. Below her, the coastline slipped away into patches of dark forest and snow-pale fields. The sky ahead was layered with light, the deeper blue of night thinning into the pale tones of morning. She thought about the frost back at the base, its delicate edges already fading in the first warmth of sunrise. That frost had been still and untouched minutes ago, and now she was moving at near supersonic speed toward a situation that would demand every fraction of her attention. The transformation from ground to sky was one she had made countless times, but today it felt sharper, more exact. The QRA klaxon still rang in memory, its call an unbroken line from the moment it began to this stretch of empty air. It was a signal that never lingered without cause. Every launch carried the possibility of nothing more than a visual confirmation, an escort. But it also carried the shadow of events that could shift in an instant. She tightened the chin strap on her oxygen mask, eyes flicking from heads-up display to the pale edge of the horizon where her target would appear. She kept her posture relaxed, hands steady, breathing even. Her thoughts moved in the disciplined sequence of checks and verifications, Yet beneath the structure, she could feel the faint pull of anticipation. The sky was clear now, the contrails ahead fixed like drawn lines between 2 points. Somewhere along those lines, paths would cross. The frost that had coated the runway seemed far away, but its stillness lingered in her mind, a reminder of what had been before the summons. Claire adjusted her course again, the radar contact now firm. She would close the distance in minutes, alone in the cockpit, with the Baltic sky unfolding in every direction. She felt the shift from readiness into the narrow, exacting focus that only came when the unknown was no longer distant. Each breath, each control input, was part of that focus. The climb was complete. The intercept was in motion. And somewhere ahead, past the thin white threads in the air, waited the reason she had been called. Claire leveled at 37,000 feet, the climb smoothing into a steady cruise. The afterburners had cooled, fuel flow held within optimal limits, and the aircraft responded to her inputs with the quiet precision she trusted. The Baltic sky was clear above and streaked with thin ribbons of cirrus that trailed into the distance. She adjusted her track into a wide arc, the practiced maneuver ensuring she approached the target without startling anyone aboard. This was intercept protocol, drilled to the point of reflex. But even in the calm, she felt the subtle shift in the mission's weight. The airliner was still a pinpoint on her display, a radar symbol holding steady against the moving sweep of the range scale. Numbers rolled down the heads-up display in disciplined sequence, closing the distance in deliberate increments. The moment when a contact transformed from an abstraction into something she could see always brought a change in her focus. For now, it remained a set of figures and a line of bearing, but the quiet surrounding those numbers told its own story. The absence of normal traffic chatter from the target's crew was a silence that pressed into her awareness. Wind tone through the cockpit canopy altered with each fractional turn. She felt the faintest change in pressure through the control stick, a subtle vibration that told her she was shifting into the correct approach corridor. Sunlight refracted through high-altitude ice crystals, scattering fine points of light against the canopy's curve. Far ahead, the white speck began to take on shape and symmetry, growing from a distant glint into a defined fuselage and wings. She kept her course adjustments minimal, letting the airliner's slow expansion in her view feel inevitable rather than forced. Her breathing was steady inside the mask, matching the controlled tempo of her actions. The harness straps at her shoulders tightened fractionally as she nudged the throttle to fine-tune her closure rate. The airliner swelled into its full dimensions against the emptiness of the blue, its bulk and stillness contrasting with the constant micro-movements of her own jet. She imagined the passengers looking out, unaware of the precise geometry bringing her closer. She had intercepted dozens of flights before, but the scale of a civilian aircraft at this height always had a quiet gravity to it. She brought the Viper into position for the formal intercept greeting. With practiced smoothness, she eased her wing into a shallow rock, holding it for the necessary seconds before returning to level. A gentle lateral slide to port completed the maneuver. At this range, the motion was impossible to miss from the cockpit of the other aircraft. Claire waited for the usual acknowledgement, a flash of wing tip light or a brief bank in return. None came. The Airbus held its exact attitude, a fixed shape in the empty air. The lack of response went into the mental ledger she kept for every mission. She maintained formation discipline, holding her position in the offset slot where she was visible to the pilots but not obstructing their forward view. Her heads-up display shifted from numeric data to the sharper resolution of visual range. She now had both worlds in front of her, the measured, digital certainty of her instruments and the direct reality of the other aircraft hanging in the same sky. It was then that the sound began, faint, intermittent, and utterly distinct from the steady comms of her AWACS channel. It pulsed into her headset with an irregular rhythm, The tone was low enough to be mistaken for interference, but its repetition suggested intent. Claire adjusted her audio filters, confirming it was not coming from any assigned frequency. The muted beeps continued, threading themselves through the constant engine hum. She made a note without breaking her formation posture. Her eyes traced the airliner's skin, catching how the sunlight wrapped a halo of reflection around its upper surfaces. In her canopy, the entire aircraft appeared again, a ghost image overlaying her own reflection in the visor. It was as if the two of them were doubled, sharing a single frame of sky. That visual connection, fleeting as it was, carried its own weight. The passengers and crew inside were moving through the same air, yet separated from her by nothing more than distance and alloy. The shift from coordinates to contact always carried a moment like this. What she had been tracking was now a presence she could measure with her own eyes. The silence of the cockpit windows facing her, the stillness of the wingtips, and the unchanging nose attitude, all built into a scene that was more about what was not happening than what was. Her role in that space was to be seen, to remind, without threatening, to hold the tension steady. Claire kept her focus forward, never letting her gaze linger too long in one place. The air at altitude was deceptively smooth, but a slight crosswind was beginning to brush against the formation. She adjusted her trim, correcting the drift without overcompensation. The encrypted tone in her headset continued in the background, steady and unresolved. She let it sit there for now, a piece of the puzzle that had yet to fit. Her oxygen flow hissed gently at each breath, marking the rhythm of the moment. The proximity to the Airbus was exact, close enough for visibility, far enough to remain safe under all conditions. She checked the heads-up display once more, confirming their speeds were matched within a fraction of a knot. The airliner's massive shape seemed to occupy the sky completely, blotting out the horizon behind it. The air around her was the same air holding the hundreds of people inside the other aircraft. That fact, simple and unchanging, formed the unspoken center of her work. She stayed where she was, the only movement the slight flex of her gloves on the control stick, and the subtle nod of her head as she kept her scan going. Somewhere beyond the steady exterior of that fuselage, something had created this silence. The distance between knowing and acting had narrowed. But for now, her task was to hold position, a presence both seen and felt in the cold blue above the Baltic. Claire eased the Viper into a precise hold, settling 300 feet off the port wingtip of the Airbus. At this distance, the aircraft's sheer size was undeniable, its wings extending far into the thin, cold air. The paint along the fuselage bore a faint matte finish under the sunlight, dulled by a film of ice crystals that glittered at certain angles. Small movements inside the passenger cabin became visible as she scanned. Some faces pressed to the glass, others leaning back, as if bracing against something unseen. Her eyes caught on one figure. A man seated at what she judged to be row 26 looked directly at her. His face was pale, unmoving, and his gaze did not waver. That steadiness had a weight to it, as if the man understood the purpose of her presence and wanted her to see him. The moment held long enough to register as deliberate before she resumed her slow sweep of the windows, noting others who shifted but avoided eye contact altogether. The encrypted beeps in her headset, steady earlier, had begun to change. They broke into a series of short and long clicks that struck her as deliberate. The sequence carried the rhythm of a pattern rather than the randomness of interference. She filed the observation mentally while holding formation with the precision expected in such close proximity. The gentle sway of the Airbus's wings in the high-altitude wind gave the impression of calm, but her own experience told her that appearances at this range could mask any number of situations inside. The rules of engagement repeated themselves in the back of her mind. Maintain visual. Do not acquire weapons lock. Do not alter the flight path unless ordered. Each directive was as familiar as muscle memory. Yet the conditions in front of her pressed against the edges of their simplicity. She kept her breathing steady, one eye on the heads-up display and the other on the shifting reflections of sunlight across the Airbus windows. High above them, two contrails crossed in the pale blue. The intersection formed a faint X that drifted slightly with the wind, a shape as temporary as it was perfect. She marked it without needing to assign meaning, though the symmetry seemed to echo the way their paths were bound together in this stretch of sky. The sight had a quiet clarity, a reminder that even the most controlled trajectories eventually meet or diverge. Her grip on the control stick was light but deliberate. Minute corrections kept her position fixed relative to the Airbus, compensating for the occasional tremor of turbulence. She felt the harness press into her collarbones whenever she made these subtle adjustments. The low hum of the avionics systems formed a steady undertone, broken now and then by a burst of static on the open monitoring channels. The clicks in her ear persisted, irregular but purposeful, threading themselves through the constant background noise. The voice from AWACS came without preamble. The clicks matched a known distress pattern, but she was to maintain her current position and await further instruction. The information was delivered as if it were routine, but the directive that followed left no room for deviation. She acknowledged without comment, keeping her tone neutral. Her eyes drifted back to the pale-faced man in row 26. He had not moved, his gaze still fixed firmly on her. The Airbus's exterior betrayed no sign of strain. Its movements were the slow oscillations expected at this altitude, the kind that could lull an observer into forgetting the speed and distance involved. She was close enough now to catch the quick flash of sunlight from a passenger's watch as an arm moved across the window. The momentary flare vanished as quickly as it appeared, leaving only the subdued glint of ice. She adjusted her trim again, keeping her relative altitude exact. The Airbus filled her peripheral vision, its long fuselage carrying the weight of the unknown. She thought about the hundreds of people inside, each one experiencing this situation differently, yet all enclosed in the same pressurized cabin. The air between them was shared at this height, yet divided by layers of alloy and rules that kept her from crossing that threshold. The man in row 26 remained a fixed point in the scene. His stillness made him more visible than anyone else on that side of the cabin. She could not know if he was the source of the clicks, but the thought took root without effort. Her task was to watch and to wait, to respond only within the boundaries of the orders she had been given. Those boundaries felt narrower with each passing minute. Above them, the contrails continued to shift, the X beginning to blur as the wind stretched the lines apart. She noted the change without breaking her scan. The sight reinforced the passing of time, the slow erosion of perfect intersections into loose, formless drift. She returned her focus to the aircraft beside her, holding the orbit as if it could keep the situation from tilting into something irreversible. The clicks in her headset faded briefly before resuming, almost as if whoever was sending them needed to regroup. The tempo was different now, faster and more urgent, though still within the structure of a code. She did not react outwardly, keeping her jet perfectly aligned. The harness creaked softly as she shifted slightly in her seat to relieve pressure on her shoulders. Each movement she made was deliberate, each second a repetition of the last in posture and position. The discipline of the orbit was as much about what she did not do as what she did. In the stillness of the high atmosphere, with nothing but the thin rush of wind outside and the low system's hum inside, the smallest signals became magnified. She understood that this was the quiet in which decisions began, the space where the invisible weight gathered before tipping in one direction or another. Claire kept her eyes moving, scanning between the airliner's windows, her own displays, and the sky beyond. Every detail mattered, every reflection, every shadow, every fleeting movement might be the thread that revealed the full shape of what she was facing. Until then, She remained where she was, steady in the cold air. The Viper locked in its place beside the silent Airbus as the moment stretched on. Claire noticed the change before her instruments confirmed it. The Airbus shifted in the sky, a degree of bank so slight that an untrained eye might have missed it. The sun glare along the fuselage slid fractionally as the nose pointed a touch off its declared course. Ice crystals that had streamed past her canopy in a clean horizontal now cut at a shallow diagonal, telling her more than any heading tape could. Her right hand tightened on the throttle for just a moment. The subtle vibration of altered airflow reached her fingertips, carried through the stick and into the bones of her wrist. The airliner's movement was not dramatic enough to trigger alerts, but it was intentional enough to make her lean forward in her harness. The path now edged toward a corridor that, if continued, would bring them toward Lithuania's capital. The coded pulses in her headset persisted, no longer clean beeps but layered with faint static. Then, in the middle of one sequence, 2 words punched through. The voice was clipped and male, English spoken with an unplaceable accent. Change course. The words carried a clarity that made her question whether they were a fault in the system or something planted there on purpose. She keyed her transmitter and reported the anomaly to command. Her tone was steady, the phrasing concise. The reply came back in the same measured cadence as always. Negative. Hold position. There was no hesitation, no request for elaboration, only the reinforcement of what she was already told to do. The man in row 26 moved for the first time. He lifted one hand and tapped against the window frame. 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Even at this distance, the rhythm carried an unmistakable shape. Morse code for SOS. The taps were not hurried, not panicked. They were deliberate, spaced with the kind of control that suggested he wanted no mistake in how they were read. Claire let her scan continue without letting her attention lock entirely on him. She checked the Airbus's wing flex, the pattern of aileron trim, the faint oscillation of the tail. The airliner was still in its altered heading, and the change was subtle enough that a crew under duress might still hide it from passengers. But combined with the coded taps and the voice fragment, the picture took on edges she could not ignore. The path they were on would reduce the margin for a safe diversion. At this altitude, every mile committed toward the capital would limit options later. She weighed the numbers in her head, thinking about fuel reserves, approach corridors, and the time it would take for a decision to come from anyone other than herself. The calculation pressed against the thin line of her orders. The ice crystals in the airflow thickened as they moved through a colder pocket, streaking past her canopy like brief, silver threads. Each one caught the light before vanishing into the blur of slipstream. Her breathing stayed even, but she could feel the difference in her pulse. She had learned long ago to let that edge sharpen her focus, rather than rush her. The next burst of clicks came faster, the tempo increasing as though urgency was bleeding through the signal. Static obscured most of it, but once again a trace of voice emerged. This time, it was less distinct, a syllable swallowed before she could make it out. It was enough to keep her certain that the interference was being shaped by human intent. She thought again of the man's pale face, the steady way he had met her eyes before. The tapping had stopped, but his stillness remained, as if that signal was all he had to give her for now. She imagined the sound from inside his cabin, the faint metal tap over the ambient hush of the pressurized air. In a cockpit, a single tone out of place could change the meaning of an entire flight. Her displays marked the drift in heading with cold precision. The deviation was small enough to justify if questioned later, but paired with the other cues, it became something more. She adjusted her trim, matching the change without closing or widening the gap between them. From the outside, nothing about her posture suggested a shift in readiness, but inside she was charting contingencies she had not been asked to consider yet. Command's detachment was not unexpected. At altitude, distance between decision-makers and the cockpit could feel like another layer of atmosphere, insulating them from the sense of immediacy she carried. But she knew the weight of what was unfolding could not be judged solely by radar plots and fuel curves. It was in the face she had seen, the coded taps she had heard, and the tone of the two words that had cut through the static. Her eyes returned to the thin contrails above, now stretched into fading threads that no longer formed the X she had marked earlier. Intersections did not last long at this altitude. They blurred, drifted, and disappeared if not acted upon in time. She wondered how far this course change would have to go before someone else decided it was worth breaking their own orbit. The vibration in the stick shifted again as the Airbus eased slightly more into its altered path. The movement was as small as before, yet she felt it immediately. The man in row 26 leaned forward, no longer framed perfectly by the window, but still visible enough to be recognized. Whether his earlier signal was meant only for her, or for anyone who might see it, she could not know. Claire held her place. The rules of engagement still bound her actions, but the reality in front of her carried a gravity the directives did not fully account for. The signals were not random. The drift was not casual. And if she was right, the space between what she had been told to do and what she might have to do was narrowing with every mile toward the city ahead. Claire's headset crackled, then settled into the flat, precise cadence of command. Do not escalate. Repeat. Do not alter orbit. The voice carried no rise in pitch, no trace of hesitation. It was the kind of instruction that left no room for interpretation. Before she could respond, the audio distortion flared again. Through the static came a clipped fragment, the words "cockpit secure" cutting through before being swallowed in noise. It was not shouted. The tone was level, controlled, and it struck her as intentional in the same way the earlier message had been. She could not tell if the voice was relief or warning, but it was clear that someone wanted her to hear it. She kept her eyes on the Airbus, still holding its subtle deviation toward the capital. The man in row 26 had not stopped his signal. His tapping was methodical, the same 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. Even from here, his gaze seemed locked on her. The cabin light flashed faintly on his window glass, creating a rhythm that merged with the sound she could almost hear in her mind. Claire's mind worked through the numbers. The closure rate between the airliner and the capital's airspace gave her only minutes before the descent path would become fixed. Once locked in, the margin for redirecting without overflying populated areas would be gone. She calculated bank angles, fuel reserves, and the amount of lateral displacement she could achieve without triggering an evasive roll from the Airbus. The Baltic coastline lay east, a broad stretch of open water and uninhabited land where an emergency descent would carry far less risk. Above, the contrails that had crossed earlier were breaking apart, their sharp edges losing definition in the thin air. The X they had once formed was unraveling into threads that drifted and dissolved. She could not ignore the feeling that her own choices were just as irreversible once set in motion. She eased her left hand over the throttle, the leather of her glove creaking softly against the grip. Her breathing stayed steady as she adjusted her trim, keeping the airliner perfectly framed in her forward canopy glass. Command chatter continued in her ear, now layered with another voice from the surveillance platform monitoring the sector. She caught phrases about radar contacts and headings, but nothing that suggested they understood the urgency of what was unfolding. The man in row 26 leaned closer to the glass. His face was partially shadowed, but the reflection of sunlight on his forehead and the precise rhythm of his tapping stood out against the featureless background. If the cockpit was secure, then whoever controlled it was not the one sending that signal. The implications tightened in her chest. She shifted her gaze briefly to the horizon. Through the thin, high-altitude haze, the coastline showed as a faint line, pale against the deep blue of the sea. It was there, within reach, if she acted now. The alternative was letting the Airbus close in on the capital until the options collapsed to none. Claire keyed her mic. Her report was calm, stating that she still had visual contact and was holding orbit. She let the transmission end without committing to more. Her right hand rolled the stick gently, enough to bring her nose toward the Airbus's forward quarter. The G-load pressed her into the harness as her Viper's wing cut across the sun, casting a brief flare along the airliner's fuselage. She kept the maneuver deliberate, smooth enough to avoid startling the passengers, but decisive enough to force the Airbus's autopilot to register her proximity. The turbulence off its wingtip rattled her canopy for a moment before settling. She watched as the airliner's nose shifted fractionally eastward, the correction almost imperceptible unless you knew exactly what to look for. Her heartbeat did not spike. Every movement of her hands and feet was measured, controlled by years of repetition. She adjusted her own course to mirror the eastward drift, keeping her position slightly ahead and above. Command's voice rose slightly in her helmet. The clipped urgency of someone realizing an order was not being followed exactly as issued. She did not answer immediately. The space between her jet and the airliner was now a physical barrier the Airbus would have to climb over or turn away from. It was enough to make the safer route the path of least resistance. The silence from the Airbus cockpit continued, an absence that carried its own weight. Overhead, the contrails continued to fray until they no longer resembled the lines that had crossed so cleanly before. She understood that what she had just done could not be unwound. Protocols existed for a reason, but so did instinct. And in the air, sometimes the responsibility for what happened next rested more heavily in the cockpit than in any distant command center. The man in row 26 sat back from the window. His tapping had stopped. Whether it was relief or simply the pause between signals, she could not tell. The Airbus maintained its adjusted heading, the capital now falling a fraction off its nose, the coastline inching closer on its new path. Claire steadied her breathing again. The maneuver was over, but the consequences were not. She held her position, keeping the airliner framed and the coastline in sight. The orders in her ear were still clear, still unyielding, but she had already made her choice. The next move, whatever it was, would come from the other aircraft. She had shifted the path. Whether that would be enough, she would know soon enough. 40 minutes later, the airliner's landing gear touched down on a NATO-secured runway. The taxi was unhurried, almost casual, as if the last hour had not existed. Passenger windows reflected the pale gold edge of morning light. Each face turned toward the frost-rimmed tarmac. Vehicles rolled into place with disciplined precision, while the Airbus came to a stop, engines fading into idle. Through her canopy, Claire watched the stair truck move forward and the cabin door open. Passengers filed down into the custody of waiting security teams. The man from row 26 did not look up. Hijackers were led away without visible resistance, their departure absorbed into the motion of uniforms and cold air. She stayed in her seat, hands still on the throttle and stick, canopy sealed against the morning chill. The frost crept along the corners of the glass, catching the light in fine, sharp lines. A slow seep of cold worked through her flight suit where the insulation had thinned from hours in the cockpit. Hydraulic fluid's faint metallic scent lingered in the closed air, mixing with the residual hum in her ears from the comms. She kept her gaze steady on the empty strip of tarmac where the aircraft had rolled past, unwilling to follow the figures disappearing into the terminal. The debrief was held in a room without windows. A single table, 2 chairs, and a pen moving over paper in steady strokes. The questions were brief, the answers precise. Her account was recorded in procedural terms, reduced to headings and times, headings and altitudes. No reprimand, no commendation, only acknowledgement of deviation from orders and the note of a safe resolution. Later, in the locker room, she opened the narrow metal door and unfastened her helmet from its cradle. The visor caught the overhead light, holding a faint reflection of her face. It was distorted slightly by the curve, a reminder of seeing the airliner framed in her canopy earlier, when choice was still measured in seconds. She set the helmet down gently and closed the door. Outside, the cold sky was unbroken except for one pale contrail. It stretched in a slow arc until it thinned into nothing, drifting without crossing another. The airfield returned to routine, the sky holding no record of what had happened below.